Okay, welcome to Chapter 1. If you've been watching the other videos, I'm telling you should probably print off the journal questions and have them handy while you're watching the video. Okay, I'm ready to start. Cool. All right, so page 1 in the book. What are the learning objectives? Basically, to being able to define the terms, that's kind of simple. Understand some of the history, because some of the history is kind of fascinating. Some additional key terms, and then the security roles as they apply. So they start off with a case study. Please take the time to read that thing. And basically a help desk and, clicking on an email attachment and, all those kinds of things. It's actually a halfway decent case study. And, there's some confusion on what you should do at the end, that kind of stuff. Yeah. Security, one of the things you're going to find out in this entire course is that humans are almost always the weak link in any type of security. It's not the software, it's not the devices, it's the humans. Okay, so introduction to information security, page 2, talks about the responsibility to protect information. Okay, and they go into some really cool examples about in World War II, they had the Enigma machine, that was a piece of hardware that did encoding for them. And so the Germans would send, communications, particularly the naval communications, to submarines and telling them where they ought to be and things of that nature. And so, it was all about keeping information safe. It was kind of pretty doggone cool. But, again, you had no real networks at the time. So basically we're talking about physical security, like, locks on a building and things like that. And, not talking about secret things, in a pub and, those kinds of things. It had nothing to do with networking at the time. Espionage and sabotage. And so there's a term they use for this. It's called guards, guns, and gates. It's all about, you have a fence up and you have a patrolling guard and, guns to keep you away and, gates to funnel all of the traffic through it, that kind of stuff. Okay, obviously, in the 1960s when we started getting a network, the whole concept of information security got turned on its head. So there's a really cool example of the 1960s, and they talk about, the ARPANET. ARPANET was the original term that they used to describe what later became the internet. ARPANET at the time was, you could have no commercial products on it whatsoever. I mean, this was just military and universities that supported military type projects. So that's basically what that thing was about. So military and research only, no commercial things going on. And they built a redundant mesh of networks. So the idea is that, you had a map, envision a map of the United States. And so they had like a connection between Chicago and, St. Louis. And instead of having just one line connected the two, they had multiple ways you could connect to it. And the idea was, this is kind of scary stuff, but you have to understand the mindset at the time. This is during the Cold War, when they were thinking if the Soviets bombed Chicago, we'd still be able to communicate from the East Coast to the West Coast. So we needed a redundant mesh of network that basically was self-healing. If a node went out for some other reason, some bizarre reason, then the communication would continue, past it. So it's kind of scary, but that's the scenario they were thinking about at the time. Okay. So in the 70s and 80s, the Ethernet protocol was developed. Okay. And it was the basis for almost all of the, the networking to come for, for hundreds, well, not hundreds of years, but for decades to come. But it had no intrinsic built-in security at all. At the time, this was a coax cable that was run from one end of a building to another end of the building, inside the building where it was physically secure. And so there was no real need. Every piece of information on the network clearly belonged there. And there was no eavesdropping. And so when they built it just for making to account for noise and packet collisions, just networking stuff. There was no thinking whatsoever about, well, wait, who has permissions to do this? Kind of crazy. And again, back in the day when you had dial-up, you couldn't keep a dial-up number secret, for example. The people were posting lists of, strange places where, just dial this number and a modem will answer. They didn't even know what the company was or the institution or whatever, just here. And so there was no inconsistent identification and authorization, mainly just plain old username and password. Nothing complicated, and names and passwords could be 3 or 4 letters. There were, again, and there was no common scheme among the sites. There was no, oh yeah, over here you have to have this, but over here you could do something different. It was just kind of weird. So they have some key dates coming up. Now, I'm not really going to make you memorize dates, but there's some interesting stuff in here. So they talk about, and this sounds kind of crazy to say this, but in 1968, they basically said, if you have multiple people on the same computer, you probably need to have passwords. As if that was a brand new idea. Well, it was. It was. And then security controls, the so-called RAND report. And it basically talked about, and the RAND report is pretty technical. It talks about, listening from a distance from, keyboard and mice, and, well, it didn't have mice back then, but monitors and cables, how they could have electronic, emissions from them, and, direct observation, indirect observation. It was a pretty detailed thing. Anyway, they talked about the design of secure military systems, and then the FIPS standard, and they came up with this, this digital encryption standard. They said, hey, we're going to use this for all our stuff. It didn't last that long because at the time it only had 56 bits in a key, and nowadays that's not near enough. And so it didn't last very long. Anyway, then protection analysis talks about protection, and then all these REST password security, a case history, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the Unix stuff. Unix was the first one who really, really, really started looking at it going, we probably need to do something about security. We ought not just have everyone able to run, Telnet or RLogin for remote access. We need to control these things. And so that's kind of where they had out. So anyway, the file-based security was relatively robust. Okay. All right. So that's basically that part. The next talk on page 6 is this guy, and this is more from the RAND report. It talks about how a thief could steal the files, and there's electromagnetic radiation coming off the processor, and if you had like a very sensitive radio receiver, you might be able to read what the computer is actually doing. It could have a hardware failure. It could have a software failure. Could have an operator. Oh yeah. And then during the line, you could have, radiation coming off of the line. So you could, maybe you don't even have to physically tap it. You just like hold the receiver up to the wire, not even actually touching it. And you could read the radio waves coming off of it. Or you could have a physical tap, or you could have crosstalk between them. And then, of course, you have operators, maintenance, and system programmers. And then some sort of switching center where, these things go off to the terminal end. So having remote access was a big thing. Back in the day when computers were in the basement of a bank or something like that, people with white lab coats would go down, and there was no really, remote kind of a connection. Everyone was hardwired in. And that was the way it worked. You rarely had an opportunity to kind of like dial in. Okay, so this is basically fun, very detailed and still relevant today. For example, the radiation part, the Army created a thing called Tempest, which was the standard for, military grade computer equipment, communication equipment that had practically no electromagnetic radiation. Anyway, Multics. The first operating system with built-in security, and then Unix came out. By the way, Unix was kind of built as a pun on Multics, Multics, Unix. Okay. I didn't get it. Anyway, so that was the first one that really had built-in security. And then, of course, Unix took over from there. In the early 80s, that's when, TCP/IP, and you've probably heard all these terms, dial-up internet service providers, those guys, the split of the ARPANET into the secure side, the MILNet stuff, and then the internet stuff. And you got to remember now, when we first started doing this excluded businesses. So it wasn't until the split happened, and it kind of made sense. It's like, wait a minute, taxpayers' dollars are paying for this connection here, and how dare you, company, come in here and make money off of this, right? That kind of thing. So yeah, it originally had excluded businesses. Okay, in the 90s, page 7, they talk about, the de facto standards came about. By the way, what does de facto mean? Does that mean official? No, it just means everyone decided to start doing this, like TCP/IP. Like, okay, that's how we're going to talk. So no one actually got together and, held a meeting and said, we vote that we're going to use TCP/IP. No, it just kind of happened. Okay. So early components were completely devoid of security. For example, the DHCP, the Dynamic Host Control Protocol, it didn't have any security to it at all. That's the thing that when your machine wakes up, it says, hey, what's my IP address? And that guy tells you. DNS, the domain naming system, that's the same thing. That's the great phone book in the sky where I say, hey, what's the IP address for www.microsoft.com? And it comes back and tells me. That didn't have any security. And replicating from one DNS server to another DNS server was fraught with problems. And again, back in the day, we're even talking the 90s now, they weren't thinking that, we need to protect DNS. It just never even occurred to them that somebody was going to tap in and start, injecting bad data in a DNS replication. And that's when antivirus products started showing up. Now, in the beginning, antivirus was basically not network-based. It was, floppy disk-based. Somebody would get, hey, man, I found this really cool game. And they would give you a floppy, and you'd poke it into your machine and boot it on up. And then, that virus would replicate to another one. And every floppy disk you created from then on would contain a copy of that virus. Okay. In the 2000s, page 7, now the vector, that's a cool term, the vector for viruses was almost always the network, typically email stuff. I got an email attachment from someone. So the weakness is, the weakest link style security. Who is the weakest link, or what is it? One poorly configured machine on a network could start spewing stuff to other people. Yeah, I remember one time having a discussion with a friend who said, well, I don't have anything on my computer, so there's no need for me to have, antivirus. It's like, no, you're not thinking straight. Your machine could be infected and serve as a base for sending out, a swarm of attacks to other people's machine. And those other people, they do care about what's on their machine. So no, it's everyone's responsibility, whether you have something on there or not. Cyber attacks, this is when, governments and state-funded actors started attacking other, so North Korea would start attacking this, that, and the other, that kind of thing. Mobile computing, of course, came out. Everyone has a phone now. And then the Internet of Things, I don't really have I have, alarm system and, cameras and stuff like that, but I don't have, and thermostat, but I don't have my refrigerator doesn't tell me that I'm low on milk or anything like that, but those things do exist. Okay, so there's a really cool story talking about how Internet of Things became kind of sort of a weakness, but it'll hang on until part 2.